and to the opening lecture in our 8-week series accompanying the annual master's course in the archaeology and topography of the city of Rome. Tonight, it's a special pleasure to present Krešimir Vuković, who will speak on early Rome. Special because not only is Krešimir an expert on archaic religion and society, but also because he's one of the more illustrious of alumni of past City of Rome courses, having attended RMA in the particularly lively class of 2013. Krešo, as we know him, is also this year's Rome Fellow at the BSR, and he's made a vital and illuminating contribution to life at the school, firing his fellow scholars and artists with enthusiasm for the recondite world of Roman myth and ritual, organising last month's The River and the City Conference, and even managing to interest the readership of the Guardian newspaper in the whereabouts of the Lupercal cave. Krešo was awarded his PhD at Oxford, where he studied with Stephen Hayworth for his work on the cult of the Lupercal, and since then he's lectured in classics at Oriel College and taught Greek and Latin at Oxford's Faculty of Classics. He's published on such intriguing themes as virgins and prostitutes in Roman mythology, the gens Fabia, and, naturally, the topography of the Lupercalia in the PBSR, Epigraphica, and Lartimus. Tonight, he gets things underway for us with a talk on early Rome, myth, history, and the environment. Would you please welcome Krešimir Vuković?
Thank you, Robert, for that lovely introduction. First of all, I must say a warm welcome to all our new award holders here at the BSR this term, and to you graduates of the City of Rome course, and of course to our Italian friends from Italian universities and the Soprintendenza. The timely arrival of new award holders and graduates makes me remember the time when I was a lad, before all this grey hair appeared. Many years ago, or not that many years ago, starting the BSR City of Rome course. Back then, when I was starting, this inaugural lecture was given by one Christopher Smith, one of the foremost experts on early Rome, and needless to say, it is more than a great honor and a privilege to be asked to step into his shoes, which is at the same time an impossible task, not least because Christopher wears a very different shoe size to mine, but of course I'll try to do my best. We are the children of our landscape. It dictates behavior and even thought in the measure to which we are responsive to it. I can think of no better identification. You may wonder why I chose to start with this seemingly radical statement, and not penned by an ancient authority, but by one Lawrence Durrell in his magnificent series of novels, The Alexandria Quartet. I will admit this is an unorthodox choice. Yet, as I enjoyed my way through Durrell's great work this last Christmas, it struck me how the story of Alexandria he tells is so similar to the story of Rome, and so ancient in its focus on the landscape and the environment. So let's start at the beginning of Roman history. In simple terms, Rome began as a series of small settlements on the hills that rose above a river floodplain. The Tiber Island was advantageous as a river crossing and facilitated trade, but the alluvial plains of Campus Martius, Velabrum, and Trastevere were most prone to regular Tiber flooding. The whole area was much more watery than it is at present, and this old map, which is but a mere reconstruction, and I think that's fine because most of these maps are partial, speculative, and definitely reconstructions. But this map gives you a rough estimate of the several streams that ran in the valleys around the hills, as well as the extent of the Tiber, which was wider than it is now. As you can see, there's a lot of water flowing around these hills. At the time, there was a whole range of torrents in the valleys, most of which are now either underground or depleted. In this lecture, we will look at the river Tiber and the relationship between the river and the torrent that ran between the capital and the Palatine through the Forum and the Velabrum Valley. So here the Tiber, and here this torrent coming down, the Velabrum in particular. Both of these waterways shaped the formation of the urban core of the city of Rome and left indelible traces in the monuments, as well as the stories that were told of the earliest period in later times. My focus throughout is on the environment, from the Tiber Valley in the Archaic period and Rome's place in it, to specific myths that were shaped by river spaces. Along the way, I must also present the main outlines of the scholarly debate that is frequently referred to as the dichotomy between myth and history, indispensable in every discussion of early Rome. The settlements on Roman hills were essentially of the same type as other settlements that we can find in the wider area of the Tiber Valley in the period of the 9th and 8th centuries BC. At this point, the archaeological record detects a number of settlements that indicate a change of habitation patterns from seasonal and nomadic to settled and stable, with a considerable rise in wealth and resources towards the end of the 8th century BC. This is the beginning of the so-called Orientalizing period, because the tombs of the aristocracy, or so-called princely tombs, display extensive evidence of Oriental, which means Greek, Phoenician, and Egyptian material influence. This is a kind of Mediterranean globalization, as Christopher Smith called it, with major civilizations taking part in a lively cultural exchange. In the second stage of the Orientalizing period, around 650 BC, larger settlements appear as communities that we can begin to call properly urban. The new towns show an increase of population, distinct evidence of greater wealth and trade with other towns of the same type, as well as a set of shared material cultural traits, hence called koine, from the Greek word that means common, as shown by many artifacts of similar production in Etruria at Latium in this period. Our best evidence for 7th century BC urban development comes from Rome itself. Huts were replaced with stone structures with timber frames, tiled roofs, and temples with complex architectural decorations. At this point, the Forum Valley was filled in and received its first pediment, which was essential in making it a city centre, a point to which I shall return below. As you can see on this map as well, instrumental in the development of urban settlements was the river Tiber and its valley, in which we find the majority of the large urban centres, such as Veii, Fidenae, Crustumerium, Rome, and Ficana. All of them engaged in a communication, trade, and competition with each other. We know of at least one major trade route that follows the course of the Tiber for hundreds of kilometers, running from the Apennine Mountains in central Italy to the salt pans at the mouth of the river. This was called Via Salaria, or Salt Road. It started as a transhumance road, which means that it was used for the seasonal movement of flocks between the Tiber Valley and the mountains to the north. In a society without refrigerators, salt was an essential commodity as a preservative. All the food you needed to store for longer periods was salted so as not to go bad, but you couldn't simply drop by a local Tesco or Carrefour to buy some salt. Salt was, of course, in the sea, and salt pans to extract salt from the sea were a crucial economic resource in the Archaic period. These were situated west of the Tiber mouth and linked to the site of Rome via a road later called Via Campana, because its destination was the field of the salt pans, in Latin the Campus Salinarum. So you can see on this side of the Tiber via Campana, and this side via Salaria. The Tiber was a powerful river, from 80 to 120 meters wide. There were no bridges. The only way to cross the river was using rafts or boats, which was risky, especially in times of storm or flooding. Of course, it helped if the river was already shallow at some points, which provided natural points of crossing. The best site for crossing was near the hills of Rome at the Tiber Island. This was the only island on the river in the area, and the next one was as far as 35 kilometers upstream. Other reasons made the site of Rome the best location in the mid-Tiber Valley. 4 kilometers north of where we stand was the river Anio, which is now called Aniene. Another natural barrier south of Rome were crags and cliffs that made access to the Tiber difficult. Further south, the river becomes wider and flows through a marshy area up to the large meander at the Magliana. So at Rome, the river access was easiest, and the island facilitated crossing the river by means of ferry boats, as it gave a foothold on the way to the other shore, which considerably reduced the width that needed to be traversed. Ferries of this sort were in use up until 1889, when they were last seen by Lanciani. The Tiber Island thus became a key strategic location, an essential node in the traffic and trade of the whole wider Tiber Valley area. The rural settlements that occupied the hills of Rome in the early Iron Age gained an importance because of their proximity to the river crossing. In addition to salt, other types of trade developed along the Via Salaria. The trading of cattle took place in the Forum Boarium, where I understand from Robert you were today, which is derived from bovis or cow, and the trade of food, fruit and other land produce was immediately further north in the Forum Holitorium, or vegetable market. The Forum Boarium was also the site of the earliest port market of Rome. It made use of the loop in the river, but was at the same time prone to flooding and silting. Core samples in the Forum Holitorium showed that the riverbank in this area was set 100 meters back in relation to present levels. It was considerably wider and flowed to the south of the capital, covering what later became the Theatre of Marcellus and all the way up to the archaic temples of Mater Matuta and Fortuna. One of the earliest Roman myths is placed in this area and talks about Hercules driving the cattle of the sun across the Tiber. Several temples of Hercules in the Forum Boarium attest to the importance of his cult in the area. The myth of slaying Cacus is clearly descended from an Indo-European prototype of the myth of dragon slaying, and shows that the story is much older than the introduction of Hercules. The name Hercules itself is a result of adopting the Greek Heracles through Etruscan mediation. Basically, the story says that Hercules, the good guy, killed Cacus, the bad guy, for in Greek kakos means bad. After this fire-belching creature stole his cattle that just had swam across the Tiber, below the Tiber Island. Hercules must have arrived with Greek and Etruscan traders, and features of his cult at the Ara Maxima, which is here, and which is now under the Church of Santa Maria in Cosmedin, also show the influence of Phoenician cults, including that of Melkart. Pottery in the Greek geometric style was found nearby below the capital, dating back to the 8th century BC, and shows the place was a merchant site already at this period. In order to facilitate trade along the river, a landing station was developed probably at this period, although we can only trace this development in later times. It was called Tiber Port, or Portus Tiberinus. In the beginning, this was not used for large-scale trading ships, but small boats and ferries. Evidence for riverine traffic appears already in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, but upstream, up the Tiber, where we find models of riverboats in the tombs of Veii, Falerii, Capena, and Orvieto. The cult of Portunus himself, the god of ports, protected river navigation from an early period. The god had a flamen, which is a trait of the oldest Roman cults, and recently Francesca Di Ossono has argued that the Leonardo tufa blocks on the site date back to an early temple of Portunus in the 6th century BC. So the early settlements on the hills begin to expand outward in the valleys between the hills, the Forum Boarium, and the Velabrum. The marshy areas are first reserved for burials, but soon come to acquire more practical functions, as we've just heard. Excavation on the Palatine Hill revealed post holes that served as support for primitive thatch and daub huts in the 8th century BC. These were found to the southwest of the hill, in the area where the hut of Romulus was later maintained in its primitive form and worshipped as the supposed house of the great founder king. It is important to keep in mind, as Holland says, the Roman valleys were much deeper than they now appear, and the hillsides defining them were steeper as well as higher. Centuries of building, rebuilding, and excavations produced a considerable amount of debris in most areas of Rome. The hills in particular are subject to erosion, which filled in the surrounding valleys. As a result, most of the ancient levels are now difficult to make out. This is most evident in some areas where religious scruples maintain the levels of late antiquity almost unchanged. And so here you have an example of the Basilica of San Vitale, which is now still 4 meters below present street level. This is much more difficult to make out in the area of the Velabrum. It is now a high saddle between the capital and the Palatine Hills, but in early times it was a low-lying valley at the height between 5 and 7 meters above sea level. The Tiber rose to a minimum 9 meters every winter, which meant that the whole Velabrum Valley was seasonally flooded. The same conditions obtained in the area of the Forum, especially its western end towards the Comitium. So before the Forum could become a city center, the valley needed to be raised by filling it in with land, a massive project that took decades to complete in the 6th century BC. Now, if the changes in the form and level of the valleys were so radical, what traces did they leave in the historical record, or as it's now fashionable to say, Roman cultural memory? There is indeed a historical tradition that the Etruscan kings of Rome, called the Tarquins, conducted the project of draining the Forum and building the Cloaca Channel. This brings us to the question of the relationship between archaeological evidence and the historic tradition, which lies behind every debate about early Rome. Is there any connection between the discoveries of archaeology and the stories of later times? If you pick up any book on the subject, you will always read that the main problem with the historical tradition is that of a gap. Mind the gap. The tradition, as handed down to us by the mainstream historians of the Augustan period, such as most famously Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, is problematic because of several reasons. First, literary embellishments. History was not a separate discipline in the ancient world. Historians wrote to a literary standard and used rhetorical devices to make their narratives more sassy. Secondly, the gap between the age of Augustus, when most of the tradition we have is first recorded, and the early period that they refer to is about 6 to 7 centuries long. Although the first written histories appear already towards the end of the 3rd century BC, most of them are no longer extant. Now, if there are genuine memories of early Rome, how would they be handed down to us through such a long stretch of time? Thirdly, the historians that we do have, for the most part, are using a variety of sources no longer available to us. So Livy, for example, is using a number of earlier historians, all of whom may have in turn tampered with the tradition. We are thus faced with a range of problems when dealing with the history of early Rome. It's often, and rightly said, that archaeology can help in solving a part of the problem by precisely dating particular monuments. But comparing the tradition with the archaeological record is not straightforward. A good example of an extreme view in this respect is that of the Italian archaeologist Andrea Carandini. Conducting excavations on the Palatine and in the Forum, Carandini proclaimed almost any material he found to be in some way parallel to the tradition of the literary sources. Thus, his book Rome Day 1 claims to uncover the archaeological remains that confirm not only the existence of the first king, but also his actions on the first day of Rome, so to speak. As you can imagine, in large part this involves some cherry-picking the evidence to fit the historical tradition and fleshing out the skeleton of archaeology with a sense for detail. A counterexample to Carandini is the approach of his archenemy and main critic, Peter Wiseman. If Carandini is, to use Robert's term, an optimist when it comes to the tradition, Wiseman is a denier. Like all people who love each other, the two also have chosen words for each other. Carandini calls Wiseman's camp the holy office of agnosticism, and Wiseman dubs Carandini dogmatic. In any case, Wiseman's position on early Rome is one of extreme skepticism. Almost nothing is known other than the fact that Greek and Etruscan traders visited the area when it was still a village. An example of Wiseman's approach is his infamous explanation of the duality in the myth of Romulus and Remus, one of the most important Roman myths. His main question is why the city founders needed to be two rather than one. It has been asked many times in the last 2 centuries and almost always tied to some duality in the Roman political system. The two consuls, Etruscan and Latin elements, Sabine and Latin origins, some sort of alliance between who and ho, take your pick. The trouble is, Wiseman really does take his pick from the existing rubble and says Romulus and Remus represent the patricians and the plebeians, the two main social classes of the Republic. This would mean that the myth is a distortion of a social reality, the so-called struggle of the orders. Wiseman concludes the myth of Romulus and Remus originated in the late 3rd century BC, in the early 3rd century BC rather, because the first attestations date to 296, when the first pair of plebeian consuls was elected to office. These were the Ogulni brothers, who erected a statue of the she-wolf with the twins, and later issued this image on coins. This, I think, absurd method can be called synchronic because it assumes that the myth is always a product of the time in which we find it first attested. As said, the whole problem with our evidence is that it begins to appear in the 3rd century BC. Does it really follow from there that the whole of Roman mythology was simply invented in that short space of time? And a number of eminent scholars have already pointed out this as a fundamental flaw in Wiseman's argument. Now, many Roman myths can be shown to be much older using the methods of comparative mythology. From a comparative perspective, The motif of twins is universally widespread across the world, and a human sacrifice at a city foundation is hardly unusual. We have countless examples of that from medieval times and from some societies even more recently. This brings us to the essential problem with Wiseman's approach to Roman mythology. Instead of studying it on its own as mythology which is thereby comparable and relative to other world mythologies, Wiseman sees it as a distortion of history, always but a shadow of some historical truth. Mythology, I think, should be studied for its own sake, as every myth is an invaluable wealth of meaning, the essential human need to get to grips with others in the world, and this cannot be reduced to a distortion of political events or structures. To clarify, I will give you a simple example of the comparative method. The mythological cycle of stories related to Romulus and Remus is very rich and includes the tales of their adolescence. At about 18 years of age, the twins become leaders of shepherds and bandits, taking them onto expeditions and cattle raids and capturing various forms of booty. The Lupercalia, one of the most important religious festivals, commemorated these events. On 15 February every year, young naked men stripped to their underwear, ran around the Palatine Hill and struck women with goatskin whips. It was basically good fun, and we've had an artistic reenactment of the festival here at the BSR just in December. The celebrations began at the cave Lupercal, where the she-wolf was believed to have nursed Romulus and Remus. Here, goats and a dog were sacrificed to Faunus, the god of the wilderness, and the blood of the goats was applied to the foreheads of two young men who were selected to represent the legendary twins. Comparatively speaking, this type of blood rite features in hunting rituals widely attested across Europe and Asia. Boys on their first hunt have their face smeared with the blood of the killed animal and are so initiated in the game. This may seem strange, but it was practiced in fox hunts in the UK until recently, and I understand Prince Charles experienced it firsthand, though you probably wouldn't guess so by just looking at him now. If we scratch the surface of the Lupercalia a bit further, there are even more interesting parallels with the religious taboos of the priest of Jupiter, called Flamen Dialis. All the actions that the Luperci must do on the day of the festival, the Flamen must never do. While the Flamen may never be completely naked, the Luperci are most noted for their nudity. The Flamen must never touch or mention a dog or goat, and these are the very animals the Luperci sacrifice. The Flamen may never even set his eyes on an army, while the Luperci identify themselves with wolves in pursuit of cattle. The Luperci use wine and oil, and these are the very substances the Flamen must avoid, etc., etc. What we have here is a very archaic religious system of symbolic, even cosmic significance that neatly compares to Vedic religion, the earliest strata of Hinduism in India, as you can see in the central column. As the chief priest of Jupiter, the Flamen Dialis finds a parallel in and is bound by pretty much the same taboos as the Brahmin, not the caste of Brahmin, which is a later invention, but the officiant at Vedic sacrifice, a kind of priest. The inescapable conclusion is that at least a part of Roman religion and mythology can be traced to a distant but common Indo-European origin, a fact which is almost universally ignored by ancient historians, but is as plain to me as the science behind the fact that Latin and Sanskrit share the same linguistic Indo-European origin. This example affirms the efficiency of the comparative method, but also points to the direct transmission of cultural memory in oral form through centuries. Granted, the Flamen and the Luperci were unique religious institutions, and most other examples will not be as structured or as clear. but it does show that the transmission of cultural memory in other instances is possible. The comparative method allows me to say something relatively new about the two examples I will be using now to portray the relationship between myth and history in early Rome. One is the myth of Vertumnus, the shapeshifter god whose sanctuary stood to the south of the Forum near the Basilica Julia. When we think of the Forum today, before us is the image of ruins, columns and stones sticking out of the ground, a pale shadow of the glory that once was the center of a great empire. However, as Sigmund Freud famously said when comparing Rome with the concept of the unconscious, every place forms a series of links with several periods of the past. Beneath the churches lie the great pagan temples and basilicas, and I add, beneath them still, the underground channel of Cloaca Maxima. The earliest layer we can uncover in this palimpsest of space is a valley in the prosaic form of a marsh. As said, the space of the Velabrum in the Archaic period was largely around 7 meters above sea level, and so subject to seasonal type of flooding. The Forum was also covered by these floods that added more water to an already rich hydrological state. Several streams ran through this area, the main one a perennial torrent flowing down the slope of the Quirinal Hill through the center of the Forum and into the area of the Velabrum where it met the Tiber. The point of convergence between the torrent and the Tiber varied over time. The river rose to cover the Forum on an annual basis, every winter. The continual flooding prevented the area from developing into a proper city center and necessitated a project to deal with this issue. The level of the valley was about 7 meters above sea level, and seasonal Tiber flooding reached above that. A great amount of ground needed to be moved to form a massive landfill to raise the level of the valley. Ammermann estimates 10 to 20 cubic meters of soil 10 to 20 tons of cubic meters of soil were moved to form this landfill. The project of draining the Forum area was so extensive and took decades to complete. Estimates go from around 600 BC down to 530 BC. Alongside the landfill, a long artificial stone channel called Cloaca was built to contain the Forum stream and to drain the water left over from the floods. The Cloaca was not a sewer at this point, which it became much later, but a fresh water channel which followed the natural properties of the terrain and the course of the Forum stream. The project was crucial in the development of Rome as a city because it gave a form of stability to its center in the Forum and enabled permanent stone structures to be built there and alongside the Sacravia. The very first pavement was built around 650 BC, followed by another layer around 625. The first building soon followed, the palace of the king called Regia, a stone circular temple of Vesta, and further east another stone structure in the area of the Comitium, which was the first curia or the Senate house. However, all construction projects were compromised by the threat of annual flooding until the ground level was raised above the seasonal Tiber floods. The archaeological evidence for the construction projects of the 7th and 6th centuries BC is conclusive. In the space of a century or so, the Forum Valley went from a swampy and wooded marsh to a new city center, complete with pavement and residential buildings. The raw data invites comparison with the narrative referring to this time. Indeed, it would be difficult to imagine that events of such massive importance to the shape and image of Rome as a city would simply go unnoticed in the historical record. So let's start with the floods. The most famous Roman myth, that of Romulus and Remus, takes place during a flood. The most memorable report is that of Livy, who writes, "It happened perhaps by some divine providence that the Tiber, having spread beyond its banks into stagnant pools, afforded nowhere any access to the regular channel of the river. And the men who brought the twins were led to hope that being infants they might be drowned, no matter how sluggish the stream. So they made shift to discharge the king's command by exposing the babes at the nearest point of the overflow, where the fig tree ruminalis now stands. When the floating basket in which the children had been exposed was left high and dry by the receding water, basically the she-wolf appeared." So Romulus and Remus are delivered from certain death by a river in flood and safely delivered to a she-wolf to be nursed. Everyone agrees that the appearance of the she-wolf is miraculous and adds an incredible element to the story. But very few have noticed that the monstrous she-wolf acting like a mother is equally surprising as the monstrous Tiber acting like a father. The myth conveys a profound truth about the foundation of Rome. Without the river, there would be no city. The floating basket slowly drifts on the shallow waters of the floodplain and reaches the Lupercal cave at the foot of the Palatine Hill. The language of myth connects the flooding river with the first settlements on the hills. Father Tiber is more than just a backdrop to mythic action here. As you can see on this altar relief from a later period, the Tiber is a figure in his own right, shaping the spaces of the city even before it is founded. His care of the abandoned infants is a sign of the river's protective role as a border against Etruscan enemies. Mythology idealizes the river flood, which was in fact destructive and took thousands of lives. Tiber's fatherly role is as miraculous as the motherly care of the savage she-wolf. The myth is not a faithful representation of events, but conveys important messages about the origins of the city. As Aldred points out, substantial flooding continued well into the imperial period, and Livy's description could be shaped not by memories of the archaic times, but even more recent or contemporary floods that he'd seen. Even if we accept that the myth of Romulus and Remus is older, particular elements in it are liable to reshaping. The myth is essential to Roman identity, but it does not simply mirror the archaeological evidence. However, other traditions can be shown to be older. The insistence of Varro and Republican historians in asserting that the Velabrum was at one point flooded by the river, not occasionally but permanently, cannot be a simple product of their imagination. The sources derive velabrum for vela, which is the word for sails, and velatura, a word for ferry, which they imagine crossed the valley between the Capitoline and the Palatine in the earliest times. Again, the relationship between archaeology and tradition is not straightforward. Archaeological research reveals that the ancients were mistaken in believing that the velabrum was covered by water all year round. The evidence rather shows it was a matter of seasonal flooding. We are dealing with the language of myth, not a distortion of history, but a way of thinking that has its own logic. Now, on the northern edge of the velabrum, at the point where it meets the Forum, we find the most enigmatic of fluvial myths. The god Terminus had a sanctuary here, and his statue was immortalized in a remarkable poem by Propertius. The poet talks to the mysterious god, who presents himself in many guises, from the girl of love poetry through fisherman and soldier to the god Bacchus. Terminus, the shapeshifter, claims mastery over time. The changing seasons and the annual cycle. The first fruits of the year are offered to him, and his divine partner Pomona was the goddess of fruits. Finally, the god mentions his supposed Etruscan origin, which was probably a product of a Roman interpretation of the Etruscan god Voltumna. All these various aspects come together in the notion of change. With his volatile nature, the god encapsulates both the shifting space, from the forum to the labrum, from man to woman, from one form to another, from Etruscan to Roman, and finally from water to dry land. Propertius reveals the name Vertumnus is a result of turning the river, verso ab amne. The poetic etymology is based on the similarity of the name with the verb vertere, to turn, and amnes, river, and finds an equivalent in Ovid's Fasti, a work on the Roman calendar. The god got his name from the act of turning back the flooding Tiber. The point is fundamental to understanding the nature of Vertumnus. Shapeshifter figures in Greek and Roman mythology are always watery creatures. Proteus, the old man of the sea, Glaucus and Nereus, the river Achelous and the nymph Thetis represent various aspects of water as sea, river, lake or spring. These figures change to fit any shape, just like water. Vertumnus is one of these creatures, and his changing nature is also evident in the real linguistic origin of his name, which is a vestige of the medial participle, meaning the one who changes himself. The shifting god bears a clear relation to the valley of the forum, which changed on an annual basis. So far, most have argued that Vertumnus was a water deity of the forum spring that needed to be somehow appeased when building the channel of the Cloaca. It is my contention that rather Vertumnus embodies the hydrological state of the valley that changed on a seasonal basis. The statue in Propertius' poem boasts of the many shapes he is able to assume, as well as his mastery over the annual cycle. This poetic transposition of Vertumnus' flexibility relies on his original nature as a spirit of the valley, which was a floodplain, and so turned from wet to relatively dry on a seasonal basis. Once the channel was constructed, the unnamed builders and their many efforts were mostly forgotten. Instead, the god who represented the waters of the valley was said to have turned back the river in the same way that he turns himself into any shape. The fact that his sanctuary stood right above the channel of the Cloaca showed that his fluvial powers were still needed to protect the city centre from flooding, for which the freshwater channel of the Cloaca was only a partial solution. It is difficult to envisage a happenstance invention of a shapeshifter figure at this very spot in later times. The myth of Vertumnus thus presents a unique rendering of the complex process that took place in the 7th and 6th century BC and was transmitted by means of oral memory, closely tied to the sanctuary of the god. However, by the time we find the myth in its developed form, the god has spilled over to assume many different forms and functions. Propertius is using him to signal the diversity of his elegiac collection, and Ovid in the Metamorphoses presents Vertumnus as a final chapter at the end of the stories of transformation, set to encapsulate both the shifting nature of his work as a whole and Ovid's own role in assuming so many different voices through his characters. Myths are not frozen in time and transmitted as undiluted vestiges of a long-gone era. Like Vertumnus, they are made to fit the shape of the vessel that carries them. A salient example of this process is the myth of Curtius, the brave Roman youth after whom the fountain of Curtius in the Forum was named. Now, the myth of Curtius has several layers, which reflect alternative versions about a fountain called Lacus Curtius that occupied the central part of the Forum. close to the area of the Comitium. It contained water in the Republic, and possibly even in early empire. Suetonius says the people threw in coins here for the health of Augustus, though Ovid says that at least the altars of Lake Curtius were dry in his day. The ancients present the fountain as a remnant of an earlier state, a reminder of the forum as it once was. Varro knows of three main stories about the lake. First, the place was struck by lightning, and a consul Curtius erected a lightning sanctuary on the site. Such lightning shrines were quite common in the Roman world, and they always had a lower underground level, accessed through a curbstone or puteal, the same word used for stones on wells. The second story presents a more clear relationship to water. Metius Curtius was a Sabine soldier who fought against the army of Romulus and got stuck at this marshy spot on his retreat from the Palatine. The third story places a Roman knight called Marcus Curtius in the mid-4th century BC. The young man rides directly into a chasm that opened up in the midst of the forum after the priest said that the gap in the ground will only close if the Roman people give the best thing they have. The brave knight puts on his armor and mounts his horse into certain death, after which the chasm closes up behind him. As you can see, the three myths could easily get us swamped in information. So, before we fall into the pit with Marcus, let's start with Metius Curtius. Hopefully we won't get bogged down with him. Metius' story takes place in the mythic time of Romulus' war with the Sabines, immediately after the founding of Rome. The story makes sense of the fact that the forum was a floodplain, and it is plausible that a horseman on a hasty retreat might get stuck here. However, as Stephen Oakley astutely observes, but the fact that the explanation of Lacus Curtius is a swamp rather than a crevasse is geologically more satisfying, does not prove the greater antiquity of this tale. Though it may be difficult to date precisely, the myth is an interesting reflection of the marshy state of the Forum Valley and its relationship to the two hills that surround it, the Capitol and the Palatine. The story goes that after the rape of the Sabine women, the Romans defended their new Palatine city against the invasion of Sabine men who encamped on the Capitoline. The battle goes badly for the Romans, who are forced to retreat up the slope of the Palatine until Romulus stops them with a prayer to Jupiter Stator, Jove the Stayer. Jupiter then reverses the course of the battle, and the Romans are now in pursuit, forcing the Sabines down the Forum Valley. It is at this point that Metius gets bogged down at the marshy lake in the middle. The story contrasts the heights of the Palatine and the Capitoline with the stress on the North Palatine approach along the Sacrovia, at the top of which the temple of Jupiter Stator really stood. The battle reversal makes sense from a strategic standpoint, for once the Romans take higher ground, they have the upper hand against the enemy. The Forum Valley is pressed in the middle between the Capitol and the Palatine, and its watery aspects come to the fore. While other sources mention a lake or marsh, in the longest of all the accounts, Plutarch attributes the cause of the wet terrain to a recent flood of the Tiber. Though Plutarch could not have directly known the conditions of the early Forum, the information is very significant because it fits our geological evidence. We have seen that memories of flooding shaped the myth of Vertumnus, and the same environmental conditions were at work here too. It is impossible to say when exactly Metius and his story become attached to Lake Curtius, but Tiber flooding certainly played a role in its formation. The archaeological evidence for the fountain may not be very helpful in this regard. The earliest phase of the construction in tufa blocks dates to the 2nd century BC, and contains traces of opus signinum, a waterproof material. This fits with Livy saying that many fountains were monumentalized in 184 BC. Plautus, in one of his comedies, places a lake in the middle of the forum, which matches its later positioning by Pliny. These passing references imply that the sanctuary itself was older, and the myth tied to it transmitted by means of oral memory. The earliest stage was a circular wellstone or puteal 3.5 meters in diameter, to the right of the picture. The enclosure around it was built later and trapezoidal in shape. A small channel to the west of the pool drained the water at least partly, and some connection to an earlier stage of Cloaca Maxima is possible. The purpose of this circular puteal is unclear, but it certainly links with the third Varronian account, which says the place was struck by lightning. The general term puteal, or wellhead, is also applied to sanctuaries of the dead, called mundus, which of course also have a lower level. The connection to mundus as an underground sanctuary is particularly interesting in view of Livy's description of the sacrifice of Marcus Curtius. The mundus pit was located further west in the forum and dedicated to the gods of the dead, the manes. Marcus' jump resembles the ritual of devotio, or dedication, in which a Roman general offered his own life as a sacrifice to these gods. There are 3 instances of this type of ritual in the historical tradition. They are all attributed to the members of the Decian clan. When a battle went badly, a Decius would ask a priest to consecrate him to the manes. He would then ride off in full armor, alone, in the midst of enemy troops, to certain death. The tale becomes a mythic trope at some point, but we know of at least one historical instance where it led to Roman victory. Marcus' sacrifice is very similar to the ritual act of devotio. He looks to the gods above and below and devotes his life as a sacrifice. Livy says, "They say that Marcus Curtius, a youth excellent in war, criticized them for debating whether any Roman good can be better than virtue in weapons. Then in silence, he beheld the temples of the gods and raised his hands now towards heaven and now down to the manes and the open chasm of the earth, and finally dedicated his life." Livy actually uses the technical term devovere, which means to dedicate, to describe Marcus' action, which suggests that the historian saw the act as a ritual devotio. Marcus' jump, riding his horse in military gear, implies a martial aspect, as one would expect in a battle. The similarities also underline the chthonic, or underworld, aspect of Marcus' sacrifice, in particular the cult of the manes. A large quantity of fruit and other earth produce was thrown in after Curtius, which recalls the abundance of the mundus situated at the temple of Saturn in the Forum, a corn silo which was open for the celebration of the Saturnalia. The circumstances of Marcus' jump in 362 BC are very interesting. According to Livy, an outbreak of pestilence 2 years before led to the introduction of theatrical plays from Etruria and the ritual celebration of the Ludi Saeculares, the secular games. But the plague continued on, and 2 years later Marcus jumped. The celebration of the secular games at the underground altar of Dis, or Pluto, which is a Roman version of Hades, adds more chthonic elements to the story. The altar was buried several meters below ground level and ceremoniously dug up every 100 years or so for the rituals, which were then called secula, from saeculum, or century. It was situated at the northwest end of Campus Martius, at a place called Tarentum, where the Ponte Vittorio Emanuele now stands. Now, Tarentum was understood as a name for the Tiber in his destructive guise as a powerful river of erosion. Tarentum actually means a crossing place, not just literally, but also metaphorically, a crossing to another world that is the focus of the cult of the dead. The Tiber is the key connection between the Forum and the Campus Martius. This is readily apparent in Livy's account. In the year before Marcus' jump, there is a Tiber flood. It stops the games in the circus, an omen that causes panic and requires expiation. The Chthonic cults come into focus because they are closely linked to water, the waters of the Tiber in particular. Marcus' sacrifice appears as another in a series of expiation rituals carried out to appease the gods that year. The parallel between a major flood of the Tiber just before the sacrifice of Marcus Curtius and, according to Plutarch, before the drowning of Metius Curtius is striking. In both cases, water claims a life. The differences are also important. While the death of the enemy Sabine Metius is accidental, Marcus, as an exemplar of Roman courage, volunteers to deliver the people from the wrath of the gods that threatens the Comitium, the very center of the Forum. Something changes about the topography as well. Romulus' Forum is a wilderness, a valley of trees and wet marshland that make for a difficult battlefield. The Republican Forum is a place of business, religion, commerce, and politics. The last thing one expects is for the ground to open up and devour you in front of the Senate House. But the Lake of Curtius is not the only place that hides mysteries below the ground. There are a number of other fountains in the Forum, and more importantly, the underground Mundus pit at the Temple of Saturn. Though these are not all the same, the Mundus has to be dry in order to store the grain supply, they do all point to a belief in an underground level beneath the Forum through which one could access the underworld. As Diane Spencer says, Curtius' plunge suggests a subterranean and usually hidden depth to the Forum that mirrors the Capitoline and Palatine heights above it. In addition, it implicitly proposes a prototype zone beneath the Forum that prefigures the Cloaca Maxima. The combination of two myths points to the Cloaca Maxima as an essential watershed in the history of the Forum, as the city center of Rome. It enabled the development of the area and city institutions, but it was also only a partial solution. Though it was no longer a yearly event, Tiber flooding continued and occasionally reached as far as the Forum. The flooding evoked the memory of earlier times when the Forum was a watery depression between the Capitol and the Palatine. Recent advances in memory studies show that all of our memory is reconstructive. We tell a story with a view of not only the past, but also the present circumstances into which it now must fit. This fluidity of memory matches the changing aspects of the myths of Marcus and Metius Curtius, both in the wake of a Tiber flood. Awareness of flooding and its extent may have shifted through time, but the inundations were recurrent enough to make the flood myths relevant and memorable. The Tiber flood of 362 BC evoked the memory of an earlier myth that was linked to flooding. The reconstructive aspect of memory then reshaped the earlier account to fit contemporary circumstances. The marshy spot turned into a great chasm in the Comitium in front of the Senate House, exposing the psychological gap between the Senate and the people. The crisis of mid-Republic was not only environmental but also political. According to Livy, the Tiber flooded in 363, the year of the first ever plebeian consul, Genucius, who died not long after taking office, which reignited the struggle of the orders. The chasm in the story of Marcus is then not simply a geological feature, but a transposition of social and psychological factors at play at the time. This is one where I agree with Peter Wiseman, though I see this as only one of the factors at play in the shaping of the myth. Finally, the elephant in the room is the question of death itself. Why does Curtius, be it Metius or Marcus, die on the spot to begin with? This is not simply a matter of memorable death to make the place more interesting. The number of myths linked to death on the banks of the Tiber is remarkable. The very name of the river is almost always explained as a result of kings or heroes who died fighting on its banks. Aeneas himself becomes a god only after his death in the river Numicus, and the nymph Anna Perenna follows a similar course. The mother of Romulus and Remus, Ilia or Rhea Silvia, ends her life by marrying the Tiber, or drowning. And the only temple of the Tiber in Rome, on the Tiber Island, houses the cult of another Vestal Virgin called Gaia, which implies she had a similar fate. The mythic deaths reflect the tool of flooding on human lives in the city of Rome. Gregory Aldred, in his book on Tiber floods, calculates that minor flooding occurred every 5 years on average and covered extensive areas of the ancient city. A major flood reached as far as the Forum, despite several projects to contain the Tiber. The number of deaths caused by flooding is difficult to estimate, but comparative data shows that to talk of a few thousand deaths in the event of a major flood is a reasonable supposition. Modern research shows that flooding still takes an unexpectedly great toll as people underestimate the power of running water. In a moderately fast current, as little as 30 centimeters of running water is enough to knock you down, and 50 centimeters is enough to float a car. In addition to immediate loss of life due to drowning, the receding waters cause a range of problems in the form of various diseases, not to mention falling buildings and substantial material losses. There is the possibility that mythic deaths on rivers reflect not just accidental drowning, but also human sacrifice. Skeletons of a young couple, man and a woman, were found at a depth of 6 meters in the central area of the Forum, next to the base of the so-called Equus Domitiani, Domitian's equestrian statue. According to Filippo Corelli, they can be dated to the 7th or 8th centuries BC, a time when the Forum was still annually flooded. The two skeletons seem to have been tied and buried alive right next to the sanctuary of the Doleola, which translates as storage caskets. This would seem to fit the evidence of Varro, who says that certain sacred objects are kept underground at the Doleola, along with skeleton bones. Varro also says that the Doleola are placed on the Cloaca Maxima, which implies a direct relationship with the Forum stream. The sanctuary is usually identified with a mass of concrete 5 meters thick, the lower end of which contained pottery hidden under a lid, preserved intact and dated to the 2nd quarter of the 7th century BC, a time when the last stages of the Cloaca Maxima were underway. Now, in the ritual of the Arge, rush puppets taken from 27 different places scattered throughout the city were also tied foot and hand, as Dionysius says, and ceremoniously thrown into the river from the Sublician bridge in the presence of the Vestal Virgins and the higher state magistrates. This ritual continued well into the empire, and the ancient sources are in agreement that the puppets were offered in the place of human victims. Though the idea of human sacrifice must remain speculative, given the destructive power of the flooding Tiber, it's not impossible to imagine such desperate attempts to appease the gods at an early period. To conclude, the human sacrifice conundrum brings us back to the issue of myth and history, that old dichotomy that still boggles the minds of ancient historians dealing with early Rome. As the poet of my alma mater, Merton College, T.S. Eliot, once wrote, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins. These fragments I have shored against my ruins." The citation is apt in more than one way. What if there is no distinction between myth and history? In Italian, like most Romance languages, the same word la storia is used for both story and history. Only stories then, pieces of the language that makes us essentially human, stories that we choose to tell ourselves, our children and others, as fragments and pockets of meaning, stretched against the vast expanse of the void of the universe. Our response to the wasteland of ruins never stops at numbers. The sheer size and circumference, the dating and materials of a temple. The raw archaeological data are only means to an end, a piecing together of fragments which you may call history, but why not call it mythology? There is something in us that makes us want to enter the temple, to understand who built it and why, for whom. What rituals did they perform there? But most of all, what did it mean? Which is also to ask, what does it mean today? We have no interest in the myth of Vertumnus if it isn't somehow relevant to our own experience, not just of some distant, long-forgotten bog of the Forum, but to The Shape of Water, and yes, I do mean the recent Oscar-winning film. Our view of the world and ourselves, the human and the environment. In the same way that classics cannot be studied only for their own sake, the very notion of classics implies a privileged relationship to the rest of literature. Something is only a classic in relation to other works. So Roman myths receive interpretation and meaning only insofar as they are part of our own lives. As Ovid famously put it at the end of the Metamorphoses, "I will live through all the centuries insofar as people continue to read me." And so Roman myths, be they of Romulus and Remus, of Vertumnus the shapeshifter, of Curtius and the Arge, live on insofar as they mean something to us. There is no better way to revive the sense of Roman myths than to see the places that created them. Try to keep this in mind as you walk the